Well, welcome. Happy New Year and welcome to the Planetary Regeneration Podcast, Christopher. It's so great to have you back on. I think you were podcast number one or two when I first started this podcast back in the day.
Wow.
It was either you or Bucky. Without looking back, without taking a moment to look back and jog my memory, I'm not sure.
Uh,
And those were, yeah, those were the days before the Cosmos Hub had launched and before IBC was live. And I think 2018, it would have been sometime in 2018. Maybe even before Interchain conversations, like that big meeting in Berlin. I don't remember if it was right after that or a little before. So a lot of water has crossed under the bridge. And I'm super excited to be circling back to just jam with you. We always have fun conversations. And I'm just really looking forward to looking back and looking forward with you.
Well, thank you. And likewise. Yeah, I'm trying now that you mentioned it, I'm trying to remember that podcast. I think we discussed like existential risks or something like this. This is the best recollection I have. And then a bunch of
Yeah, and
random, yeah.
I was kind of poking a little bit, I don't remember too deeply, but I was kind of poking a little bit on the, what could go wrong with
hmm
this,
hmm
you know, with
Right, right, right,
with
right, right.
connecting everything into an inter-blockchain messaging system, and where might we want to maintain sort of controls, whether those are capital controls or privacy controls or community governance checks on certain functionality. And so we did talk a little bit about that, kind of like, I guess, sort of, how do we think about structuring things versus sort of like infinite connectivity? And that's one of the things, I mean, the domain of that conversation seems like it's something that you've been working on a lot after shipping IBC. Well, maybe just for guests and listeners, maybe just give a quick introduction to what you're working on now. Like, what are you working on? I think that kind of gets right to the point of things in a way. But why don't you just talk a little bit about Anoma and Namada and just where you're spending your time and attention and the kind of research questions that you're currently digging into.
Yeah, absolutely. So my background comes from, I don't know, some combination of naive techno-optimism, which I may or may not have been cured of. Now, looking back on it, I think it was naive, but what in 3 years will I think of, on the next iteration of this podcast, how will I reflect on this one? So to be determined, but and some amount of erstwhile philosophy, which I'm constantly trying to unify, which results in strange concepts. But before, I guess the last conversation we had was mostly about IBC and Cosmos, which I was working on then. And in the past 2 years or so, I have been working on the Anoma and Namada projects. So of those two, Namada is simpler, so I'll explain it first. Namada is simply a layer one Cosmos chain in that it uses Tendermint and speaks IBC, designed to provide multi-asset privacy as a usable product for people who want to send private transactions, do private public goods funding, all of the stuff that you might do with a blockchain if you just wanted to do payments, but privately, which sounds so obvious that I still find it difficult to believe that no one has really turned this into a product yet. But it's 2024 and it still doesn't exist. So we'll do it until someone outcompetes us doing it, which I would also be happy about. That's Namada. And Anoma, what is Anoma? Boy, I mean, at first, I think Anoma was like, at the time of our last conversation, Anoma was my attempt to, at the time I was reading a lot of continental philosophy because it was COVID, and what do you do when you're stuck in an apartment for 6 months? I mean, before then, I had been keeping strictly to the like, I must live out of two suitcases limit. And I think that was a really good, like, self-discipline choice, and I completely lost it during COVID because I was just stuck in an apartment for 9 months, and I bought a lot of books. Also I wasn't buying anything, right? I mean, I had still income and I paid the apartment rent, and bought some salads and energy bars, whatever it was that I ate during COVID, and I didn't spend any money on anything else, so I just bought some books. And at the time, I was going through kind of um, parts of the continental philosophy tradition, Heidegger, Hegel, and also parts of kind of contemporary media theory, discourse on systems of coordination, stuff like this, and trying to, figure out. I guess what I was looking for after IBC was a better theory of product. So what I mean by a theory of product is a theory that explains what all of these kind of abstract and typically, syntactical or kind of purely um, programming language or tool-based systems of coordination would look like from the perspective of the user, and why a user would want to use these systems, and what they would be, the affordances that such system would offer them, and kind of a theory of like what makes a system of coordination good or bad. At the time I had some intuition that, oh, well, blockchains are useful for anything. They're useful for kind of a collective coordination, maybe as a tool of different particulars than the ones we have available to us at the moment, such as law and joint stock corporations and these other things. And I was looking for a unified theory of what exactly that was, so that as opposed to um, kind of designing a whole system that would turn out not to have been used, either not to be useful or to kind of be used for other things than the thing that I was hoping that it might be used for, I would be able to make more informed decisions from the outset. The other, I just have to plug this talk until everyone has watched it because it's so good and it will save you years. The other talk that inspired Anoma is a talk by Moxie Marlinspike. I believe it's at 32C3, 33C3, one of the Chaos Computer Congresses, where he talks about why Signal wasn't decentralized. And the basic reason he explains for why he made that choice, and it was a very conscious choice because a bunch of people were pushing him to like make Signal a federated protocol, more like Matrix, allow users to run their own servers, have the app like switch between servers, stuff like this. Moxie refused to do that because he said that the single highest cost you pay in federating a protocol is the speed of protocol iteration. So if Signal accepted like, oh, we'll have all these users running your own servers, great, it's more censorship resistant. I mean, there are benefits. He didn't deny that. But then, it will be so hard to change our protocol because every time we want to change the protocol, instead of just like pushing it to, Signal's AWS region, we have to coordinate all of these like independent software developers who have preferences and different Unix setups and whatever it is to update the protocol, and then we will lose to Facebook and to Google and to, I guess WhatsApp. I don't know if WhatsApp was separate then or not. All of these other corporations who can just iterate on their protocol instantly because they control the servers. And our goal is to build privacy for regular people as much as possible, and so protocol iteration matters more to us than federation. That was his kind of argument in the talk, and that argument, sadly, despite like this lesson has been learned in the collective, knowledge base, and it's on the internet. I think very few people in the blockchain land understand this like trade-off. That if you
Yeah.
get your protocol wrong and you deploy something, IBC is a good example of this. I think IBC, I don't have a unique position on this. It's just my own perspective, but IBC got many things right and got some things wrong. And in both cases, it's kind of too late to change most of those decisions, or at the very least, it's going to take years, to like to change how channels work in IBC or to negotiate upgrades across this, complex network of change. It's just very, very time consuming. And so the cost of getting those decisions wrong when you're building a decentralized system is astronomically high. It's like higher than anything else. You can do almost everything else right. You can like make most of the right choices. You can communicate to the right people. You can explain how to use the system in the right way. And if you make one or two protocol design decisions wrong, you're just screwed. It's very unforgiving, but
So this is a really great, I mean, this is a really great topic, and we feel that pain point at Region Network Development at R&D all the time, right? Where we chose to develop Region Ledger and this decentralized, protocol, but also that makes focusing on the specific stakeholders and user groups and science problems really much harder because
Right.
so I have a couple questions. It sort of structures a couple questions to maybe pull out some of what you've learned or how your thinking has evolved around this. Um, so you were saying that Anoma arose as a sort of experiment in trying to change your approach to product. I think that's what you
Yeah,
said.
yeah,
I think
yeah. I mean,
that's
I
kind
still
of what you
haven't.
said. And then you started talking about signal and the challenge. And yet, Anoma is, if anything, seems like it's a deeper layer down of abstraction, thus the challenge of speaking about it. Um, so the stakes it almost seems like, from an outside perspective at least, you almost like double down on you got to get it right the first time. We're going to start from first principles and we're going to build something, having learned a couple of times, we're going to try this again and build something that's very deep down on the stack. Is that correct? As
Yeah, that.
opposed to somebody going like, hey, all I care about is this user. And I'm just going to do agile development cycles on their behalf infinitely. And I don't have a sort of like first principle based sort of like paradigm that's leading me to maybe like have short-term pain for long-term benefit. It's just like pure short-term pain avoidance as a product discipline, which is maybe you know that's kind of like agile in a nutshell. Maybe that's not completely fair, but I think it's kind of directionally correct, versus this sort of like from first principles, almost like philosophical or paradigmatic or even theoretical approach to product.
Right. Yeah, that's I think a very accurate characterization. And one reason that we choose to take this first principles approach, it's not that we think that it's like the right thing to do, or the only right thing to do. I think it's also very important to have a bunch of like short-term iteration going on and experimentation going on. But it's that I think that it's rare in at least in the broad industry in which we operate, and the fact that there are many people pursuing this experimentalist approach in public means that we can kind of both benefit from doing something different, right? Because we can get all of this data. Like we didn't, I haven't worked on Signal, but I can watch Moxie's talk and understand how some of these factors played into the economics that they were considering, and I can observe how Signal turned out. Similarly, I can observe different projects within the Cosmos and Ethereum ecosystems, which are live and are often taking a more, um, let's just call it like, as you say, agile methodology or a shorter product cycle development oriented approach, and see how that goes and use that as to kind of like whatever theory of product that Anoma comes up with, our theory had better be able to explain like the actual data, right? If the actual data, doesn't fit the theory, then the theory is wrong. Now, what we want the theory to do more than that, we want it to also say like, not only for these things that actually happened, how will they go, well or not well, and in what ways, but also for other things that no one has done yet. How will they go well or not well, and in what ways? And if we have a good kind of like theory that's a few layers removed from practice, but still connectable to it in specific instances, then this should help guide like our development choices to enable the kind of long-term use cases that we want. So, yeah, that's the basic reason for the approach.
Okay, so what is Anoma? So getting back to the thread, what Namada is sort of privacy as a product in the blockchain space, um, for a number of different applications, but transaction being maybe the biggest. And what's Anoma? Um,
Right. To give some more concrete answers to this question, first there are kind of two ways. One, Anoma is just a piece of software. It's code that you download, you run it on your computer. Pretty much everything anyone is building in the space is some kind of software. Anoma is no different. Now, as a kind of as a conceptual work, the best metaphor that I've found after a few years of investigating this is an operating system. So I'll say that Anoma is an operating system.
Well,
And
how would I was actually going to interrogate this a little bit. Could you compare? Some listeners may be familiar with like Urbit, for
mhm,
instance, which is which proclaims itself as an operating system. Similarly, and maybe has different, um, probably has a different political economic philosophy,
mhm.
uh, and may or may not have different computer science approaches. I don't know. I don't know enough, but is that sort of like the best um, benchmark or sort of like competitor or peer approach, or is it like apples and oranges and it's not a very good analogy?
I mean, I think Urbit and Anoma they're similar in ways that I definitely didn't realize at first. Like, we didn't set out to build an operating system. I
Mm-hmm.
had no background in that field beyond some, random college courses and no conscious intention at the time. 2 years ago, I was just thinking about like systems of coordination, not operating systems in the computer science language.
Right.
But um, there are definitely, I mean, both projects are kind of they're both operating systems in the sense that they like abstract some kind of hardware and provide a way to write programs. And they're both operating systems in the sense that they like consciously identify themselves to be operating systems and try to consider design from that holistic perspective. Now, I would argue that Ethereum and Cosmos are also operating systems.
Hmm.
They're just operating systems that don't really realize that they're operating systems. And so they make a lot of, ad hoc design choices instead of perhaps more systematic ones. Now, Urbit and Anoma they're operating, as I understand them at least, they're operating systems at different levels. So Urbit it is a network operating system, but a lot of what Urbit is trying to do is like replace Unix, right? It's Unix plus like deterministic, um, reconstruction of message send patterns between peers. Urbit is not trying to provide like distributed systems. There's no consensus. There's nothing really in the way of, zero knowledge proofs or programmable disclosure. They are more focused on replacing Unix in the stack. And I mean, uh, speaking, I don't know, freely, I think that's a good idea. Unix is not a very good operating system. Or rather, Unix is an operating system that was designed to solve the problems of 1970. And the problems of
Yeah.
1970 included, for example, that all computers had like 8 kilobytes of memory or whatever. I was not around. I don't know. They had very little memory. And so you could not make programs that used a lot of memory. You had to like um, make little programs that used a little bit of memory at a time. And when you wanted to send input between multiple programs, you had to do it in a stream sort of way. And apparently, according to the operating system history that I read, this is why Unix has like pipes and this whole like serialization, deserialization thing instead of just first class types in the operating system. So there are a bunch of like decisions that are really costly for applications built on top because Unix as an operating system doesn't do very much, right? It has very little in terms of support for types or objects or kind of more complex memory management patterns that, as far as I could tell, were mostly made because of hardware constraints in 1970. And all of these, computers that we're running Unix on in 2024 don't have these constraints at all. And so we're still using, an operating system that's 50 years old. I think more people should be trying to do that, not just Urbit.
So, but Anoma is not trying to be an operating system in that at that layer, in which like most people would think of an operating system of like, yep, I install it on my computer, and it allows me to program that computer to do X, Y,
Right.
and Z. Yeah.
That's right. So rather than a operating system for your computer, Anoma is a distributed operating system. So it's designed to abstract multiple computers and make
And
them look
unify
like,
them into a single coordinated operating system.
yeah, yeah, that's right. Or in some sense, a single abstract machine. Now, we
Kind of like
still want to
so like
be,
the World Computer Ethereum or Ethereum as world computer. Not to say that Anoma's ambition is to be a singular world computer, but that kind of like, okay, we have this networked, yeah, sort of
Right,
network
right. I mean,
computer.
I think that metaphor, the metaphor of a world computer is um, a good one in some ways and a bad one in others. One
Mhm.
way in which it's good, I think, is that it captures an idea of unity. Like there should be, in some sense, there should be one world computer. You want like some abstraction that everyone can use, right? Now, a sense in which I think that it can be taken the wrong way is that it talks about it can be taken to mean like one logical world computer. And one logical world computer, a single sort of source of truth, implies one singular choice of who to trust. It implies one global trust domain. And this is, in fact, what Ethereum, I think you see the kind of legacy of choice of metaphors here in the actual political structure and socioeconomic structure that has emerged around Ethereum, where even the terminology, layer two, layer three, despite often appearing to be technological terminology, is really political terminology. It's
Yeah.
talking about a relationship to the singular trust domain of the Ethereum main chain and Ethereum, the ETH asset. And that, I think of one world computer in that sense, similarly to one world government. And it doesn't inspire a lot of confidence personally. There may be large scale trust domains, but also I don't think that it civil like in computer design nowadays, one of the challenges that both operating systems designers and developers have is dealing with the reality of multiple processors and kind of complex distributed ordering problems. And complex distributed ordering problems, in my kind of sky high philosophical view, are not really a choice that you make as an architecture designer. They are just a fact of the way that the universe operates, viewed from the perspective of the operating system designer. Processing, there's a limit to how much stuff you can process in one logical place. The most fundamental cost that you cannot reduce is the cost of sending messages, right? And you can do more processing, but you need to do it in different places. Your CPU is already spread out across space, and that it appears to you as one like core that proceeds in sequence is just like the fact that the costs of messaging within that core have been incorporated into the speed that you perceive, right? But if you want to reckon with designing programs for even nowadays computers or certainly distributed operating systems, you have to deal with multiple sources of truth in ordering. And so
So
Anoma tries to reckon with this.
so I'm gonna just keep sort of like in a smooth brain sort of fashion, trying to grab analogies, and you can keep contrasting and riffing on them. So 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 what I'm gathering is that Anoma is it's a network protocol that allows a group of computers to operate with consensus, um, and then the applications that a network of computers, and then run applications that require consensus.
Right, right.
And to do so, starting from first principles, and aware that it is actually sort of like the build out of those applications, um, requires a level of thoughtful design of that operating system to sort of achieve the kind of performance and usability that people need to build complex social, economic, um, tools to coordinate on different things. That there's just sort of, maybe it's so unlike, I'm that last bit is sort of like, I'm taking what you said about Ethereum and Cosmos as examples of blockchains or consensus protocols that aren't conscious that they're operating systems, and therefore maybe make mistakes, that could be avoided in, I guess, sort of like programmability, maybe.
Yeah. I mean that's a much better explanation than probably my past two paragraphs. So I'm not even sure if I would go as far as to say that they're mistakes. I mean, different
The
people can have
trade-offs,
different
like, yeah,
aims.
they
Yeah.
optimize for something, but that makes it not achieve something that you and your co-founders at Anoma think is important. So maybe why don't we go there? Like, what's the thing that when you look at existing blockchain software,
Mhm.
you're going, oh man, like that doesn't quite, and we started out with the podcast and you were mentioning, sort of from a certain perspective, but blockchains are a new institution type. They do things either better or differently from a joint stock corporation or a government or other existing analog social systems that humans use to coordinate on different things. Um,
Mhm.
and there's these first couple generations of blockchains, Ethereum, Cosmos, etc., achieve something, but they don't achieve what you're looking at thinking, oh, this is what could be possible for blockchains as kind of as computational infrastructure and institution. So what is it that they don't achieve, that you're sort of like that all the work, the research, the development, the funding, the teamwork, the community building around Anoma, and I guess Namada is a first product being launched out of the Anoma ecosystem. What is if you could point to what the gap is?
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So my, I guess, theory of what people, and not specifically, I mean, also me, but also other people, if I just build a product for myself, that would be a bit lonely. My theory of what people want out of blockchains as operating systems is that they want an abstraction that abstracts over many computers. So they want a distributed operating system that abstracts the resources of those computers, that abstracts computational resources and storage resources, that abstracts the kind of ordering and message sending between those computers, and that provides programmable disclosure or programmable privacy and programmable trust. And it is those things in kind of a unified whole, I don't think have been provided by any existing
The
software. I
programmable
think
privacy, programmable trust, also programmable compute and programmable transaction.
programmable compute and storage, or just the
So
abstraction of compute and storage.
transaction, storage, transaction, or storage messaging. We could just say storage messaging, compute, privacy, and um, did I miss something?
Yeah, programmable trust.
Trust. Yeah, that's the big one. Okay, so I'm just going to reorder that in my brain. So what Anoma is attempting to do is create software that allows any network of computers to have access to tools that make it easy to program trust, messaging, compute, storage, um, and I'm always missing one. I always drop the fifth one. Um,
Uh, Programmable disclosure.
privacy. Yeah,
Hmm.
privacy.
Hmm.
Yeah, cool. Yeah, and then none of the, it's like privacy is clunky on first generation blockchains. It like wasn't even really thought of except for as pseudonyms, basically.
Hmm.
Um, so that's one thing. Also, at a generalized protocol, you have folks like Filecoin, or you have folks like Akash. You have people using blockchain technology to try to accomplish one or the other, like compute or storage. But it isn't just like a general toolkit that's available to anyone to just access and use. So you guys are trying to go down that deeper layer and think from first principles, like this is the bundle of things that are like broadly useful across any application that anybody could think of, and everybody's hitting them piecemeal with their individual users or their individual projects. And you guys just sort of stepped out and raised some money and thought, let's approach all of these from first principles to just make something that accomplishes those out of the gate.
Yes. And I must thank you for working with me through this explanation on this podcast. I wanted to try a new one in 2024, New Year's resolutions, and I haven't tried Anoma as an operating system before, and it's clear that I need some practice. But I think we're
Well,
getting
having
somewhere.
that and I haven't like looked at the Noma materials or website recently. You guys always have great web pages and stuff. Great design team. That stack of five, this is what these are. That seems really useful, right?
Right. It does. It does. We're going to steal it. I can already tell you.
Yeah, no,
So
totally. No, it's great. It's like that's fantastic. Like it's not stealing because I'm just asking you questions and you're, so there's no thievery involved here. So I'm just co-thinking. So privacy, trust, programmable privacy, programmable trust, compute programmable. I'm using the word programmable. I don't know if it's quite right when dealing with compute and storage, but I kind of think it is, right? Because you might be prioritizing where the compute takes place or with whom, or where the storage takes place and with whom, and the parameters of that, and then messaging. And those are the five fundamentals that and I don't know if there's more, but those are the five fundamentals that you're sort of saying any application to sort of in this distributed and decentralized future world in which there are digitally native institutions, meaning there are groups of computers and humans who want to coordinate with one another. Those are the five things that make coordination possible. And trying to build from first principles an operating system that allows those five things to happen, seamlessly and with great efficiency and effectiveness.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think that if you look at the blockchain ecosystem today, all of these components already exist. They just aren't very unified and they aren't abstracted at the right level. One distinction maybe that's worth noting here is that programmable trust is it's not at the same level as like programmable storage. It's like a level above everything, right? Because depending on who you trust, you will want to store data with different parties. Depending on who you trust, you will want to disclose data with different parties. So programmable trust really interacts with everything else. I think there are kind of two common patterns in the blockchain industry today that are
Trust
very
and privacy,
different.
right? The same is true. The trust and privacy go really deeply together. And maybe it's
Right,
even sometimes hard to pull them apart. Because if you trust someone deeply, you don't need to be private.
right,
And to
right,
the
right.
degree to which you distrust someone, you increase the level of privacy that you might want from them.
Right. So I'm is another New Year's resolution, this one spontaneous. I am boycotting the word privacy. I refuse to use it.
Okay.
Privacy, I do not think privacy exists in digital networks. I
Yeah.
think privacy, maybe it's like,
Disclosure. You're using the word
they,
disclosure. Yeah.
right, right, right. I mean, it's not, we think of privacy as hiding, right? And in a world where light beams are bouncing all around, causing problems, this makes sense. My windows are open. If I don't want my neighbor to see what I'm up to, I need to pull down the blinds. I need privacy, right? I need to do something in order to block observations. This analogy does not hold for digital networks. My laptop has my data unless I choose to send it somewhere else. We don't need to build privacy. Privacy is already there. The only thing that, the reason why we are talking about privacy in this way, collectively, I would guess has a lot to do with surveillance capitalism more than it has to do with the fundamental, properties of the devices involved. And if you just think of what we're doing with devices, well, what we want to do is share information with each other. We just want control over precisely what that information is. Using zero knowledge proofs, for example, you can prove specific properties about some data, which something like a passport, without revealing all of it. And that's when you think like an operating systems designer, that's what you're thinking about is how to build this kind of programmable disclosure. If you think about programmable privacy, it's like, well, I don't need to make something private. I just need to choose what to share. And I think that we also want that concept to be kind of translated and reflected in an accurate way in the user-facing interfaces. So yeah, and rant, but
Cool. And and you guys raised a fair amount of money to do this, right? Like good chunk, couple rounds of funding, and with the idea that there would be a launch of a tokenized Anoma network that provides these kind of as services essentially to users.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think there's a little bit of a distinction here. So we have raised funding, indeed, very lucky to do that. Thank you to everyone who helped. And we will launch an Anoma network token, or the Anoma Foundation will make a Genesis block proposal for such a token. This is, it's more distinct. The launch, the kind of way in which the network works does not specifically privilege the token. It's not like with Ethereum, there's the thing that launched was the Ethereum blockchain, and then there was the ETH token, and the ETH token has a special role in the Ethereum blockchain. And certainly there will be a consensus performed by holders and stakers of the Anoma token, but otherwise you can run the Anoma network software and not use that token. It has nothing, there's no
There
necessary
is it, and
connection.
is it like that the network needs to go through governance to create allow lists or to create other tokens that might be used, or simply that like peers can choose to accept whatever digital message and or token exists, or what's the level of like the token isn't central,
Right.
how,
I mean, no, all of those choices are just made individually by peers. All peers might choose to run some kind of on-demand consensus amongst themselves if they wanted to, some subset of the current nodes running the network wanted to start a new consensus together. I mean, I certainly hope that the Anoma token itself will be useful, but I view it as kind of very intentionally, we want to separate these dimensions of competition, of protocol competition and of asset competition.
yeah.
And we're investigating, for example, different kinds of, I think the most important thing for asset competition is distribution. So we're investigating different kinds of maybe fairer distribution for the Anoma token based on some kind of decentralized proof of humanity or something like this. And we, aim to create something useful on that front as well, but it is fully independent from the protocol. And you can just run the Anoma protocol without using the token. No one, there's no rent gatekeeping, right? And
Bless your
in
investors for allowing you to have so much freedom of creative exploration. That's awesome.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully it's also a good strategy. And I think that
Yeah.
it probably is. It's very difficult for what you see also in the blockchain space at the moment is a lot of protocol fragmentation, especially in the Ethereum ecosystem. And protocol fragmentation has very high user-facing costs, right?
Oh my God.
Like,
I like recently I like funding public goods, and I'm a long time Gitcoin user and experimenter and whatnot. And I basically refuse to use it at the moment because it's just
mhm.
I have to it's like I've got 15 minutes and I want to fund. I just want to give my money away to some cool people. And sorry, Kevin, if you're listening, and Ben and Gitcoin team, not meaning to kvetch about you guys. I know everybody's working hard. It's not really Gitcoin's problem. The problem is that people. The problem is what you just said, which is that there's a conflation between asset competition and protocol competition. So you have a team like Optimism, which is it's great. There's a cool culture. They want to do retroactive public goods funding. There's all these amazing things to say. So not trying to
Mhm,
be
mhm,
a
mhm.
hater, but they logically want things to happen on their L2. And so they're going to do a matching round or this, that, the other, which then forces me to move from Ethereum or Polygon or wherever it is over. And then I got to do this, that, and the other. And I've got to move and wait and bridge. And then there's always a little risk because you're moving things from one place to another. And there's that moment of dread for 5 seconds before, or 15 or 30 or 15 minutes or however long it takes depending on what the product. Anyway, it's a real thing. It's a really big challenge and like I guess my observation is like I care. There are people that I want to like, do supporting funding little bits here and there, like engage with. I'm bought in philosophically. I understand how to use the tech, and yet I bounced off of that. Right? Because I was just like, dude, I got 10 minutes right now. I gotta do this other thing. I gotta do that other thing. I don't have 45 minutes to work through this, challenge, this UX challenge at this moment. Um, and I can only imagine what it might be like for someone who isn't already kind of like bought in. And if I'm just like you're a casual user who wants to go fund a climate action or something like that, that is death to me. And also, disclaimer, like we have those places in Regen network user experience all over the place too, right? It's part of the problem with, honestly, it's part of the big challenge of it isn't, you mentioned, the reason why Signal decided to stay sort of centralized, centrally managed as a service, being their ability to upgrade and iterate. But also this is a common user experience challenge when asking people to manage public-private keys and then having a disjointed protocol ecosystem in which there's janky ways to reconcile between protocols. It just makes a simple thing like, hey, I want to go offset my carbon into this, like, oh, do you have a Kepler wallet? Do you have your Regen? Did you bridge Axelar USDC over to the thing? And did you and where's the docs for that? And I don't, anyway, it sort of creates this whole crazy Rube Goldstein style, like in order to crack the egg and and fry it, you have this giant contraption where everything's moving. And so how is so I'm curious, I'll just keep talking while you're looking for for whatever there. I guess it sort of raises the big question that emerges out of this sort of like, okay, we have to be honest that the user experience in Web3 is crappy, and it's a giant barrier for adoption. In our case, for people and companies, organizations that want to fund climate action, biodiversity preservation, local food sovereignty, whatever it is, having to do with kind of like nature, ag, regeneration. How is Anoma, in looking forward, how does the separation, so how does this or other things and the way that you guys are approaching things, how does the separation between kind of the protocol and the asset competition axis, or other special ways that you guys are approaching things, help solve some of these massive UX problems to leverage these sort of distributed, decentralized coordination technologies and have a great user experience?
Right. So I think one, aspect of our approach, which may be interesting in this angle, is that separating out protocol and asset competition allows you to like standardize much more of the protocol without necessitating that users use a particular asset. So we can standardize, for example, things like bridging or interoperability. We can standardize the description of programs. We can standardize the language for talking about abstracted storage and computation without coupling that choice to some choice of who to trust that users might not want to make. So a lot of, I think, unfortunately, a lot of the malaise or economic theories of Silicon Valley have been misappropriated into the blockchain ecosystem, in particular SaaS. It's just been switched a little bit to protocol as a service, right? There's a lot of stuff that is protocol as a service nowadays. You know, Filecoin is like storage as a protocol as a service. In some way, the Ethereum main chain is providing ordering or trust as a service for rollups or L2s. There are many different little protocols in the ecosystem that try and provide different kinds of indexing as a service, statistics as a service, stuff like this. And that approach is quick. It has a kind of advantage in the short-term product market cycle because you can provide, a library that your user can import, and it kind of just solves their problem immediately. But the way in which it solves their problem immediately is by introducing an additional trust assumption. So in this model, the development and operation of the protocol and service are coupled, right? So now maybe the operation is done by a validator set, like in the case of Filecoin, but it's still coupled. There's a Filecoin protocol, and specifically the Filecoin validators run that protocol, and it tries to provide this like magic abstraction, like this AWS-like abstraction for storage. And I mean, Filecoin is like, seriously well-considered protocol to provide that kind of abstraction. I just think it's the wrong abstraction. I don't think we want to provide that kind of abstraction because storage decisions, to me, are going to be coupled with trust and also coupled with locality. Like sometimes you want storage on the same physical machine where you're doing some compute. You don't necessarily want it to be like through this opaque abstraction barrier. So now it's if Anoma, let's suppose that there were a different world where we tried to build a protocol that did all of these things, but then you had to use, one asset all of the time. That would be less compelling, I think, because then people would have to choose, do I choose to use this protocol and pay in this asset, or do I do nothing, right? Their choices are coupled. They have less freedom. Whereas in a world where they can choose to use the protocol, but not the asset, the protocol with a different asset, even just the asset and only parts of the protocol, they have many more choices. So in some sense, I would understand software as a service or protocol as a service as just kind of trying to restrict freedoms, not always consciously, often just kind of, well, that's the business model. I think that will fail in the long term. But in the short term, it can, sometimes work for a little while, but comes with high costs in terms of protocol fragmentation. And I mean, when I use Ethereum applications, I have no idea what trust assumptions. When I use Google, at least I know. At least I've like signed a contract with Google, Google Inc. or Google Switzerland or whatever. And I may not like them, but at least I know who my counterparty is and like what the escalation policies are. There's a document that I read, and the legal system ain't perfect, but like it's something, right? When I use ADAP on Ethereum, I have no idea. I have no idea. There are 5 indexing providers. They're like somebody's startup. I didn't sign contracts with any of them. I have like no escalation, no specified way to resolve disputes if they happen. It's realistically, it's worse. And I think we should kind of admit that and try and come up with protocols and interfaces that can render these trust assumptions much more explicit to users and give users control.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely work on this a lot at Regen, just in terms of, because primarily what we're doing is kind of like trying to facilitate bilateral or multilateral agreements between counterparties about ecological state, some of which our business is a party to, and some of which our business is explicitly not a party to, and they're only using the protocol and not any of the various services that might be provided by us in order to help check or certify or whatever. Yeah, and it's super clunky and challenging to do. Do you have software for me to fix it?
Well, I mean, all of my philosophical pandering could also be read as an excuse for why is Anoma so late. But 2024, I can say that.
Okay.
It's the year.
And so what's it? So, maybe just to close out the cycle on Anoma, and then we can kind of like maybe look a little bit more broadly and keep weaving it in as we go, but look a little bit more broadly as well. What is a you know, who is Anoma going to compete with, and who is Anoma going to collaborate with? Who is Anoma going to empower? And who is Anoma going to empower out of the gate, and who is Anoma going to be competing with out of the gate?
Right. I think there are two different answers to this question, and depends on whether you're talking about the protocol or the asset. And I want to distinguish them because
Great.
I think that difference is
Yep.
important. So, Anoma, the protocol, um, competes with it competes with, I mean, I really do think like eventually the areas of competition for protocols and assets are just distinct. So I would say that Anoma competes with some other protocols. For example, we have a different VM that's different than both EVM and that different than COSM-WASM. So in a certain sense, that that VM kind of competes. It's, competes maybe as strong. It's like an alternative to, do we think that, I mean, we think that Intel competes with AMD, but do we think that an i7 competes with an i5? I mean, they're just chips, right? But they are alternatives. They fulfill the same purpose. And Anoma, in that sense, is an alternative to many other protocols. In operation, the protocol, I would say, competes with the financial system. And it does a lot of things that the financial system doesn't try to do. Um, and it also, as an operating system, it competes with parts of the protocols used by other entities. So a specific example that I think is relatively legible is Uber. So Uber is a company that does basically three things. One thing they do is that they wrote a protocol that defines the rules for booking cars. They have a bunch of mapping algorithms. They have ways to represent cars and drivers and ratings and interactions over time and all of this stuff. They built a protocol. Thing two that Uber does is that they operate a centralized matchmaking service. So they match drivers and riders, right? When you want a car, when you're a driver, you tell Uber like your intent basically, and Uber figures out how to match you. That's thing two. And thing three, whether or not they do a good job of it, Uber is at least nominally an insurance agent, or sometimes even a reinsurer, depending on their relationships with the operational cab companies. When you book a ride with Uber, they are your counterparty in some sense. And if something goes horribly wrong, you can complain to them about it. They might or might not do anything, and they might or might not be liable. I mean, they're also like not a good actor in many ways. But they kind of fulfilled this role, right? So three basic roles. They built the protocol, they run a matching service, and they are an insurance agent. And Anoma aims to kind of carve the joints of some of these things differently. So in a world where someone built a car sharing application on Anoma, these three roles would be more separate. So when there would be an application on Anoma, Anoma would be the kind of operating system. It would be an operating system that handles a lot of the parts of what Uber's protocol actually does. So Uber runs a distributed system, right? They have tons of cars and drivers, they have tons of servers all around the world, and Anoma as an operating system would abstract some of that. So Anoma would compete with part of the protocol, and Anoma provides counterparty discovery, which is very similar to the kind which like an application like Uber needs. So Anoma as an operating system will abstract some of part two, right? So that instead of there being one company which runs, counterparty discovery service, there could just be a bunch of solvers in different places. The actual solving part of this is not that hard, right? Now, what Anoma does not do as a protocol is three. Anoma is not an insurance agent, right? Now, maybe you could use Anoma as an operating system to, represent insurance contracts or other things like that, but there would still be different insurance agents. And of course, the thing which Uber doesn't really do is actually own or drive cars, right? They're just this like giant intermediary that does all the intermediary stuff. They don't do any of the actual work. And there would be, in such an Anoma car sharing app, there would be like drivers and riders. And there would be one application, but many different trust zones. So instead of there being this like one California intermediary to everything, you would use the like Anoma Uber application, and you would basically roam between these different networks of solvers and drivers and other writers or what have you. And the advantage of
Unless
this
it's
separate,
more, unless for some reason it's better and people have preference to, like have a relationship with a single trust entity across different zones, potentially. Like there's a world in which, that maybe it's more responsible and more user-centric, and who
Mhm,
knows
mhm, mhm.
what its attributes are that would make this make more sense. But I could conceive of a system. It's like, yep, actually, it's kind of the same provider across different jurisdictions that's making the guarantee for some reason, right?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, people can certainly still choose that. I think many of the advantages of, for example, using Uber, you can still get in such a system just by standardizing the protocol. So one advantage of using Uber is that you have one app and you can go to different places in the world and you don't need to download 20 different apps and you don't need to figure out how they work and you don't need to make user accounts for each one. And this advantage is preserved by having a standardized operating system. So there can still be one application. It's just not controlled. All of your data doesn't necessarily go to one person. So the application and the operator are separable. Another advantage of using Uber is that you get one kind of counterparty or reinsurer, and that advantage is not, if you want one reinsurer for everyone because they can balance more risk, then that advantage persists even in a world in which, there's Anoma as an operating system. But
Yeah,
these maybe are separable.
yeah. So I kind of want to double click there for a second. I mean, obviously, it's incredibly compelling and exciting, and double clicking on the sort of like the competition dynamics here. The Uber example is a great one, right? It's like forever I've thought, why the hell isn't there a cooperative Uber?
Hmm.
And all the attempts to do a cooperative Ubers seem like they failed. And I have probably, in a small way, participated, despite my preference otherwise, in those competitors failing. Because when I go to city X, right, I'm going to pull up my phone when I get to the airport and pull up Uber. And I'm going to like do, instead of currently what I'd have to do is like, I've got to search, is there a plausible one? What are my trust assumptions? Do I want to take a gamble on this when I know that this,
Right,
that, the
right.
other, and maybe I'm disgruntled and I don't like shareholder, maximization off of the back of my consumer choices and the work of the taxi driver or whatever, and I'd prefer something else. But at the end of the day, I'm just going to like do the easy thing. Um, so the network effect builds around the user experience. And in our work, just to kind of like be devil's advocate for a moment, against myself and Regen Network as much as against Anoma,
Hmm, hmm,
by the
hmm.
way, but um, to what degree are we being overly optimistic and idealistic when we think that we will be able to outcompete the network effects of an aggressive centralized counterparty by how great does the software have to be to actually overcome those entrenched network effects, essentially around usability and ease. um
Hmm, hmm.
how great, and on those two dimensions, there's ease of updating and iteration we were talking about with Signal, and there's ease of the user experience that I was expressing around my relationship with Gitcoin, for instance.
Hmm, hmm,
um,
hmm.
which of course is very different than like GoFundMe, for instance. If I had had a set of GoFundMe options, I would have just done it in a heartbeat, right? Because it's so easy. It's so ridiculously easy that I just boom, boom, click, 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 done. It took me 3 minutes to fund all my friends to do the thing, and I did it once, as opposed to like an hour and a half or whatever it was going to take me to like click through and get the and we're going to bridge this and wait and then come back after it's been bridged and then do the thing and sign the thing. And okay, so what is the level of awesomeness that Anoma or any of us who are competing in this decentralized space need to achieve to actually outcompete that ease of usability and the network effect that it engenders?
Right. I mean, I think it is a lot, and I don't want, um, my goal in design is to clearly articulate the way in which a system must work to kind of in this case, be decentralized or separate these roles in a way in which that it seems like plausibly we might want. I don't really want to take a position on like how hard is it to actually dislodge Uber the company because I just don't know a lot about the specific operational mechanics of that question. I mean, I
Sure.
would say hard, seems hard. On the other hand, Uber is not that efficient as a company. Like they burn through tons of venture capital. It's not clear in, all else remaining the same. It's difficult, but in 5 years, all else will not be remaining the same. Like the world changes. And one thing you do see over time is that the cost, like political heterogeneity, has a tendency of reasserting itself. At first, Uber was able to just bulldoze over the local laws and local regulations. They could just move more quickly than the governments. They could kind of get their drivers to click buttons in the app or whatever. And I mean, in my very anecdotal, not systematic data, but what I've observed over time is that heterogeneity coming back. And, in a lot of places in Europe, Uber is just like they're really just taking a cut. And they're really just taking a cut from American tourists. And the locals have already switched and they're already, in fact, Uber is just contracting the same company which actually operate like it's back to a taxi company. There's a taxi company that operates the cars, and Uber just like fronts it with the app, and then they extract their cut for convenience from the tourists. And locally, I mean, the arrangement is not it's not that bad actually,
Totally. Yeah. No, no,
but it's
fair.
also not that different. Like
Fair.
nothing, there's just this, the American tourists are getting taxed. Like that is the net, right? That is the net of this system at this
Although,
point in
although I
some
will
places.
say, as an American tourist who's done both, who's like landed and been like, I'll just take a cab
Right.
versus I'll take an Uber. Actually, universally, it costs me less money taking an Uber because depending, of course, on the culture, but most taxi cab drivers will not think twice about being like, oh, my meter's broken. It's going to cost you whatever.
Right,
And
right, right.
I don't fucking know how much it costs. And then I get there and then I look at Uber later and I'm like, wow, I paid double for that. Anyway.
Right. I mean, I'm not saying that it's, I think the service is real, right? Like it may be, in fact, quite reasonable to pay for this consciously. I'm not saying that you're doing the wrong thing. I mean, I do much the same. Um, but I guess I am saying that it's not, um, in many cases, in some cases, the like political structure of what Uber is doing is already like not that far away from what I'm proposing. It's just there are several layers of inefficiency in between because the protocols aren't standardized, right? Uber is almost a reinsurer and kind of a negotiator on your behalf with some of these local companies. And then their, data is going to multiple places that it doesn't need to be going. But like at some viewpoint, the change I'm proposing looks more like an internal reorganization to Uber systems and some choices being more explicit in your app and some protocols being more open source. And maybe the cost just goes down, right? Like it's not, Uber, it's not necessarily the case that we're trying to make Uber the company go bankrupt by
Yeah.
replacing it with
Yeah. Yeah.
something
Yeah.
else that does the same, right? So
Yeah. Yeah. No,
um
understood. But creating the, I mean, I think creating the open infrastructure for competition to be happening in the right places versus sort of the wrong places seems like a important premise that is kind of underneath a
right.
lot of what you're talking about. Okay, cool. Well, so we've sort of talked through some of who Anoma competes with at the protocol level, financial system, other virtual distributed machines like the EVM, Filecoin's new virtual machine, probably on the list, CosmWasm, maybe
Hmm.
Solana's VM, um, which I don't know what it's called. I don't remember
Just
what
SVM, yeah.
SVM. Yeah, yeah. Um, Anybody else on that protocol competition? In the financial, maybe I already said this. The financial system.
I mean, the financial system as a whole, I don't pretend to know all the protocols that are involved there. I think there's some COBOL, a lot of
Swift,
spreadsheets. Right,
Swift,
right. Some Swift.
maybe. So maybe you're competing with also like between the incumbent financial system and like Ripple or something like that, which is competing with them, and by proxy, Anoma offers an alternative to settlement, essentially, right?
Yeah,
Cool.
broadly, I think that's right.
Okay. And then how easy is it for those competitors to just simply like look at what's going on and be like, sweet, I can use Anoma and operate my current business better?
I mean, in principle, it's pretty easy. All of our code is public. Some of it is, it's unclear whether, like, when you look at the banking system. Okay, so the banking system, especially in the US, is giant. It's like a ridiculous, GDP, very flawed measure, but still measure something. It's like a ridiculous fraction of GDP. And the actual accounting calculations which the banking system performs are not that complicated, right? There's a lot of relationship management, there's a lot of, legal negotiation. I would argue there's a lot of rent extraction, but the actual protocol part of this, either way, is not super complicated. Now, it's also not very standardized because it emerged from this, history of non-digital banking systems, right? Which really did do, pen and paper accounting and needed to operate things in a much different way. And that has sort of been gradually transitioned over time. But it's not, the system was never designed consciously to be even digitally first from kind of the grounds up. So the banks certainly could adopt Anoma. I mean, it would render a lot of what they're currently doing kind of unnecessary. And then you wonder, are those savings going to be passed on to consumers, or are they going to be captured in more rents in some way? I don't know. I think though that it kind of, um, you know, our goal is more to make it much more feasible for someone to kind of compete with the banking system, like individuals with an application like Circles running on top of Anoma to issue their own currencies, personal credit tokens in the case of Circles, or even you and me when we're splitting a bill, we can use our own tokenized USD stablecoins with like 3 clicks instead of paying some issuer like Circle to do that for us. Our goal is to make it much easier for like everyone else to compete with the banking system. As issuer, I mean, banks issue credit money, right? In various kinds of differently abstracted and differently legally classified ways. But I would say that we want to at least make a protocol that standardizes all of the hard parts so that everyone can do that very easily. And then the choice of which monies to use can be made perhaps on a more personal or a more trust-based basis, instead of having this like designated class of bankers and banks who are specifically able to do that kind of issuance.
Cool. So Anoma as the home of CoFi, or collaborative finance, a home where it's easy to do mutual credit or just split a restaurant bill. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, more broadly, like, so there are the banking systems and then the bankers. And the bankers have a very privileged relationship to the banking systems, namely they control them. And
Yeah.
only the people in the world of money for the most part today, only the people who have that privileged relationship can issue money and kind of see how it gets routed around and do all this other stuff.
But the fundamental
And
thing that you're saying is that by abstracting trust assumptions and disclosure assumptions and messaging protocols and compute and storage, it becomes pretty easy for people to rearrange that sort of fundamental trust assumption around who is responsible for sort of like issuing and managing credit, basically.
yeah, that's right.
All the way
And
down
I
to
mean,
like you and I could do a peer-to-peer credit swap, or we could have a community group like Circles, or we or um and it can kind of allow for a gradient from large institutional credit and trust management down to sort of like very small individual to individual credit and trust management, and we can see what actually makes sense as a society.
Right. I mean, broadly, the kind of thing which standardized protocols can do in terms of rebalancing, power across society is that they can give people who didn't previously have an ability to do something because it was too complicated, or too operationally expensive, the ability to do that thing. So yes, the bankers can use Anoma, but the bankers can issue money anyways. There are a bunch of people who can't issue money anyways in this sort of at least generally programmable way. And maybe Anoma gives them that affordance which they didn't previously have. So it's kind of this sense in which I think about things. And we can't control this exactly and don't try to, but I certainly want to encourage applications like Ko-Fi, and I think those are the most genuinely interesting directions in the blockchain space at the moment,
Totally.
broadly speaking.
Um, okay, now, um, who does Anoma compete with and or collaborate with on the asset side of things, like the digital asset? We could have a whole side conversation about the moneyness of the Anoma token versus whatever other roles it might play. So feel free to speak to that as it relates to, I guess, sort of the competitive dynamics and opportunity, I guess, of the Anoma token to fulfill a niche within the digital asset ecosystem, and like who's going to want to hold Anoma, and what are the things that they're like, what's the choice that they're making? Is it an either or an addition to? Yeah.
Right. I mean, we have not progressed as far in some of these design questions, I will say, as we have progressed in the protocol questions. We've been focusing on the protocol first. So some of these answers are a little bit more speculative. I would certainly characterize this choice as is most choices in the digital asset ecosystem as, you know, a both and one. I mean, it's always the case that users can sell one asset and buy another asset, but they don't have to. They could hold multiple assets at once. And if we, treat these assets as kind of tokens representing some kind of ownership stake in different communities, then, many people want to be in multiple communities. So I think that's quite possible. We don't, as asset designers, even we don't make that kind of decision. Um, I think one, difference maybe between the philosophy of what I expect that we will propose in terms of asset issuance and distribution and the philosophy of many assets in the cryptocurrency ecosystem is our approach towards kind of distribution and scarcity over time. So a lot of assets in the cryptocurrency ecosystem uh, seem to take implicitly or explicitly some kind of hard money philosophy that is based on scarcity of the digital token itself. So, like, Bitcoin has a supply cap of 21 million, and Ethereum is doing this burn thing now and kind of trying to reduce the supply. Even the Cosmos have recently passed a proposal to reduce atom issuance, and it seems to be kind of progressing in the same general direction.
Sort of. They kind of really just like decreased the upper bounds of inflation, which is anyway, that was a very confusing from a monetary policy perspective. Maybe at some point we
Right.
should talk about that.
Well, I did not read all of the material there, so my characterization may not be accurate.
That was
But
definitely what was characterized, but the details of it, my understanding of the details is we as a Cosmos Hub community voted to decrease the upper bounds of inflation when there's less than 66% bonded.
mhm.
But because there was more than 66% bonded, there is more than 66% bonded right now, it didn't at all impact the real sort of like inflation. So it's basically just decreased security for no upside. So there would have been ways to think anyway. That's my
Hmm.
understanding of exactly what happened. It like decreased the upper bounds from 20% to 10% or whatever. So it's but to me it was like a mimetic thing. It was like, look, we're like decreasing the potential future supply, but it really didn't make any significant difference in issuance as long as there's more staking than not staking. Anyway,
Interesting. Well, that was not exactly the same as my understanding, so I will need to go re-review the
double
proposal.
check and get back to me. I'm pretty sure that's what happened.
Okay, interesting. Yeah, I mean, in any case, I'm not. I think, yeah, I guess I have a pretty different theory of money. And in my theory of money, one thing, you want to align the distribution and redistribution and holdings of an asset in your community with the people in the community who are doing productive work towards some shared goal. And the goal of a monetary design should be to like do that. And the world is always changing, right? People are always doing different things. They're always changing what communities they want to be part of. They're changing what they want to do. That's very natural. And I think similarly, you want um, a monetary policy that kind of reflects that reality. And if you just design your money to be scarce, then you will end up with a bunch of people who started out holding it when it was cheap, continuing to hold it, and hopefully some of them will give it away or trade with it or whatever. But you're not really like there's no alignment. So in some sense, the thing which I just view different currencies as measuring different things, right? And the thing which Bitcoin right now is measuring is early adopters to Bitcoin. And that is, something that you might want to measure. For example, if you wanted to give an airdrop to early adopters of Bitcoin, the Bitcoin distribution is a pretty good way to do that. And as I don't know, American institutional capital buys Bitcoin or whatever, then Bitcoin will start to measure American institutional capital. And if you wanted to give an airdrop to American institutional capital, I don't know why, but it's possible. Then you could use Bitcoin's distribution to do that, right? But that's not a community, right? Because the distribution has nothing to do with production of some shared value or some shared good or idea, even. So our goal in designing a monetary policy for Anoma is rather to come up with a distribution policy that is designed to align the distribution of the asset over time with some actual thing that's going on. And there are a few different ideas of doing this. One thing we're trying to kind of come up with is a sort of decentralized kind of proof of humanity test that's just based on bilateral associations. So different like you and I, for example, could use our public keys to sign an attestation that we think the person controlling the other public key is human. And if you have a whole graph of these that's not fully, you don't want it to be known to a single observer, but we can do some kind of decentralized proof of humanity where I test a bunch of links from you to me in the graph if I want to see, if given some trust assumptions, we think that each other are real humans without revealing any other information. And I think this kind of test, which we're still in the process of sort of theorizing and designing, could serve as an interesting distribution mechanism. So that's one thing we're exploring. Another thing we're exploring is a kind of different kinds of voting for public goods funding, retroactive distribution, different kinds that don't necessarily require a centralized point of consensus. And then I think that distribution would be oriented around, different things that the Anoma community is producing. So yeah, I would say over time, the way I conceptualize the competition of assets, at least, is that assets represent different, or they measure different communities, and they measure different, not exactly values, but different like practices of values in how the distribution function of each asset tries to align with people who are doing a different thing in the real world. And if you want to support that thing in the real world, you could hold or retroactively fund or even purchase that asset. So I view people as kind of voting in that sense, and that's how we would conceptualize the problem.
Nice.
So, for
Cool.
example, regen, I would view. I don't know if this is accurate, but holding and kind of supporting holding regen is in part a vote for your and the regen community's philosophy of uh, earth regeneration and all of the specific ways in which you practice that, which I don't fully understand. But
Yeah, no, I think that that's accurate, and we think a lot also about how do we upgrade the token distribution beyond this sort of like naive sort of like I'm signing blocks and therefore I get tokens to something more like I'm administering a credit class and the associated
Mhm.
scientific protocols and digital protocols and trust graph and other things, or I'm providing ecological data, or I'm stewarding land that has an associated confirmed digital identity, or whatever it is, similar. And so it's a very interesting, I mean, that's an interesting, fun and challenging kind of like economics design space to sort of like figure all of that out. It's super fun. So do you kind of conceptualize Anoma as a app chain, or as a sort of multi-application layer one, in quotes, or will people be running, are you going to sort of take the Solana approach in a nutshell, where it's sort of like, yeah, we're trying to get a really broad set of users and kind of have settlement and transactions taking place on a single state machine? Or are you aiming a little bit more for sort of the Cosmos approach, where it's sort of like maybe that, but also maybe there's like 30 forks of the Anoma code with individual validator sets that are interoperating different state machines, or somewhere in between?
Right, great question. So let me compare Anoma specifically to Cosmos because it's the closest from this perspective, and I think it will make the distinctions clear. So compared to Cosmos, Anoma standardizes more of the protocol stack. So in Cosmos, you have different zones, different security domains, different trust domains, which typically they almost always run Tendermint and IBC. Although you can run those two independently, but mostly they run both of those, and many of them additionally run the Cosmos SDK. And then they have some custom state machine built specifically for their zone, designed to serve a specific application purpose. This is like the app chain model, right? Anoma, so you have kind of compatibility there at the Tendermint layer and at the IBC layer, but not at the application layer, right? The Osmosis application is tied to the Osmosis chain. The Regen credit ledger application is somewhat, maybe you have Cosmosm in between, but somewhat tied to the Regen chain. You have applications specific to each chain. Anoma abstracts things at a slightly higher level, so that security domains and applications are decoupled, as in they can move between each other whenever they want. So instead of forking the Anoma code base, there's just one Anoma software package, which you would run on your validator. But as opposed to Tendermint, that software package can handle multiple security domains. So you would configure it like, well, I want to participate with these other validators, or I want to participate in consensi where people pay me in these assets. And you could say, I only want to run these applications if you want to. And then your node would connect to the peer-to-peer network and start serving all of that traffic. So say if you wanted to there are like all of these different applications on Cosmos, those would become applications on Anoma, but instead of, there's like Anoma has a programming abstraction. So you can write those applications on, our, I guess, EVM alternative, or so to speak. And then the applications can move between different security domains. So there's no need to fork the software, in other words, because the software already is not specific to a state machine or a security domain.
Cool, interesting. Yeah, so it's sort of like, yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense, and sounds and like takes away a lot of pain for and a lot of the, it's like in the Cosmos world, it's always an interesting intersection between kind of the political economy and economic incentives and the technology. It's like, how much does it cost for us to align, is a perpetual barrier to cooperation. It's a perpetual barrier to cooperation in the way that Cosmos, I think it's an unintentional consequence of sort of like a lot of good thinking and appropriate philosophical approach. It's like the philosophical approach of Cosmos is right, but that first generation of technology maybe didn't quite get right the standardization questions. And the outcome is, it's like coordination is really expensive. Cooperation is really expensive across app chains. Well, not necessarily. There are examples. You just have to, well, it is. You have to do a lot of application work to get to the point where you can very seamlessly, like, have interactions via IBC that are really meaningful for your users, or you have to like migrate completely, or dissolve, do mergers and acquisitions. So it creates a very yeah, a very interesting ecosystem. And so I'm just thinking how Anoma is going to disrupt that and transform that. Of course, I think what you're saying, though, the first hurdle towards people engaging with those greener pastures, or that blue sky opportunity of, just being able to choose the right trust assumptions and run with the right set of peers, whether that's a global set of peers or a local set of peers, is one must adopt the VM, right? And shift out of wherever you were, or develop from scratch, in order to then have access to that capability.
Yes, that's right. Now, there are many applications, for example, on Ethereum and even on Cosmos, must build a lot of stuff into their application because Ethereum or Cosmos or as operating systems don't do that stuff. For example, they often must build in their own indexing solutions. They often must build in their own like identity abstractions, account abstraction systems. They often must build in their own privacy systems. Neither Ethereum nor Cosmos, from a tech stack perspective, or operating systems perspective, support privacy. And Anoma does a lot more from the kind of base level perspective. So hopefully it's not necessarily the case that you have to take your big application and port it all to RVM. It's more like there are some parts of your application which are the actual like key different sort of business logics that you have, or key, like for example, you have logic to represent ecological contracts and carbon credits and different, I assume like you have an ontology of, different symbols that correspond to actual things in the real world, right? And that is, from Anoma's perspective, those things are your application and everything else is not. So all of the like, the COSM WASM parts of Regen Ledger, the like state indexing parts, all of that we view as in the domain of the stuff that Anoma as an operating system is supposed to, handle and kind of abstract for you and give you control over. Of course, you can still specify like what data needs to be stored and for how long and who should do the indexing, but to kind of provide a nice programmatic abstraction barrier so that you don't need to worry about most of those protocols yourselves as an application developer. So
that's awesome. And let me ask some hard questions about that. That's a huge amount of work to build and upkeep sort of like a standard set of libraries, account abstraction tools, identifier badging, all of these systems. That work involves highly intelligent, highly paid humans, and both for engineers as well as sort of like product, developer relation people. One of the biggest challenges in, that you and I have had many one-on-one conversations with and been involved in many public processes and conversations with, have been the challenges that the Cosmos ecosystem has faced in sort of like maintaining and improving the stack that is publicly available for creating app chains. And so it seems to me that, where there is centralization in Anoma is that there is like this singular software that provides a standard set of tools that, if done appropriately, it creates this, transformative software that can then be applied and improved. How are you all thinking about I guess, like the technocracy or bureaucracy or administration of the maintenance and upgrading of that specific tech stack.
Right, right.
What
That's
have you learned from, the past? And how are you thinking about it sort of now and moving forward so that you are able to really deliver on that promise, I guess?
right. That's a great question. And this is probably in some ways, maybe the hardest question of ANOMA in practice. It's also perhaps the hardest question for a lot of other projects, but we don't want to introduce a dependency on another priest class of technologists. There's enough of that already. Um, I think one thing that we try to do very consciously is approach the questions of standardization at the right level of abstraction. As in, we want to standardize things at a layer that, specifies the interfaces of different parts of the system and how they work together, but not exactly how they work internally. So let me give an example of a zero knowledge proof system. So zero knowledge proof systems are still an active research area. Every 3 months, there's a new paper, someone comes up with a new lookup technique, and it's faster. So Anoma would fail if we tried to pick the right zero knowledge proof system, because the right zero knowledge proof system probably hasn't been invented yet. It's probably going to be invented in like 2027 or something. This is like how, Microsoft would have failed if they tried to design the right CPU, the CPU to end all CPUs and made their operating system work specifically for that CPU. They would have failed, right? So instead, what they did is they designed an abstraction. They didn't necessarily design this. Intel or AMD designed it, but different industry participants agreed on, instruction sets that many CPUs could run. And so Intel could keep building like better hardware, and Microsoft could keep building. I don't know if their operating systems got better, but at least different operating systems which used that abstraction, and they both agreed on the abstraction, and agreeing on the abstraction meant that they could make totally different decisions in their separate domains without needing to consult each other or agree with each other. And so Anoma tries really hard to get these abstraction boundaries correct. So for example, we don't standardize a zero knowledge proof system in any of the architecture. So you could, in the future, say someone in 2026 invents a new zero knowledge proof system, still does proof verify, the basic interface is the same, but they change all the internals, you should just be able to swap that into Anoma. Now, you will still need to agree, just like when, you're sending proofs around to other parties, they need to know which proof system those proofs are using. You'll need to agree on some things, but that decision is not coupled with any decisions made by like us as the sort of initial architects. So largely our strategy is to try and get those abstraction boundaries correct so that in some sense we almost don't want to make any decisions. Like given the scope of the problem that Anoma tries to solve, we try and kind of fit the interfaces inside the operating system to that problem and make no decisions beyond doing that. So that in the future, if people, also want to solve this problem, then hopefully Anoma has kind of configured things in a way that will make sense for them, and they can make all of the specific decisions on, what CPUs to use, or the analogous question there, and on who to trust, and on what information to disclose, etc., themselves. So, yeah, TCP/IP, I'd say, is a good success story here. It is a complex protocol, and it has been pretty successfully distributed, and there are many independent companies in the world who have enough TCP/IP knowledge that it's not dependent on one central party. There are other problems with the internet like DNS, but at least TCP/IP as a protocol stack is decent. And probably our approach will be, we will try and, I don't know, fund different implementations purposely built by different teams once the spec is to a point where that makes sense, stuff like this. A lot of that's still to be done. So
Got it. So that's how. So your all work is a hard one, which is to get to the level of the abstraction and complete specification and reference build out, such that you can then fund multiple teams to build kind of like competing implementations following the same specs. And
yes,
conceivably competing business models using those competing specs, just thinking of like long term, so that they're up and moving, and like there's things they have some way of funding things on their own to keep the implementation alive and to sort of like continue operating and other things. One thing that was going through my mind is you were at the very beginning of your explanation when you said, you don't want to become yet another sort of like priest class. My first thought was, oh, well, shit, I was just hoping you'd be a better priest class. Because, and let me like elaborate a little bit, because I think my perception of part of the problem in the Cosmos ecosystem is that the responsibility of, there's like sort of like an ideological allergy to taking responsibility for the fact that there's a set of people who are actually acting as a priest class, which then means that they do a really bad job, even though they're de facto the priest class.
Yeah.
And so part of this is, of course, sort of like, preserving, ease of exit and accountability, and accountability cycles and other things, like, and kind of programming that in, but also just sort of like acknowledging that many of us in some ways are wading in to compete to be techno priests, and that like there's a little bit of a song and dance around not wanting to be a priest, a techno priest, while being a techno priest. And that's understandable given people's allergy to the surveillance capitalist techno priests who give you very little option and whatever. So I get how that all comes about. But for me, at least where I'm sitting, trying to build things and do things, is mostly what I want is for people to just like be clear and take responsibility, and to find, like, if I'm going to be an entrepreneur, I'm going to be a builder, and I'm going to, for instance, use the Anoma VM or whatever it is, or whatever, and be like, cool, okay, now I'm about to start a multi-year cycle with many, probably as an early adopter, probably I need millions of dollars to develop the software needed to go to market with a particular thing. And so what I want is things that minimize my risk through stability, responsibility, accountability, and like great, user responsiveness. Like, like there's going to be somebody on the end of the phone when I'm like, shit, I can't figure out how this library works, or like, yo, I found a bug in the code, or whatever it is. Like, mostly what needs to happen is like there's somebody there that's responsive and fast, squashes the bug or fixes the thing or deploys the next layer of features that I'm waiting on, or whatever it is, effectively, efficiently, and just like nails that. And that's one of the things that I think that like the Web3 community broadly, we struggle with, because we want decentralization and we want openness and we want collaboration, we want volunteerism. And the best models that we can see in the world of like fast, effective, responsive bureaucracies are also centralized and hierarchical. So we sort of tend to think like, oh, we can't have that level of efficacy and accountability in the system. I don't know, maybe I'm projecting, but that's my sense of where we're at. And I guess this is more of a provocation. It's like, and not just to you, but to all of us, but also to you guys, because you're building out a nascent ecosystem and you still have time to like nail this. What does it look like to have an efficient, effective technocracy at the heart that's accountable to users in the community, but takes its responsibility seriously and gets the right people in, and those people are stoked. They're like stoked to be responsible, accountable, open source technocrats that are fucking nailing it, right? What has to happen for that to be true?
Right. I mean, I think, when I say that we don't want to be techno priests, a large part of what I mean is that we don't want to be a kind of continuous class of, I don't know, some kind of central group that is making decisions over time and everyone has to block on those decisions. So the
Yeah.
reason
Well,
we
you
try
got to
and
rip out you what I think what you're saying is you or I what I would say is you have to have meritocracy and openness. So it's like you and other people who invented it need to be able to both move on and or get kicked out when
Mhm.
you're not the best people for maintaining something, basically, based
Yeah,
on
and we want
merit somehow.
yeah,
Effective,
and I would say
right?
we want things to be centralized for the right period of time.
Yeah.
So initially, the design of Anoma is centralized. That is true for all operating systems projects in the history of ever. You cannot design an operating system with, 500 people. It doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
And I don't even think decentralization is a goal in this context.
No,
We're
no,
designing
it's
something
not.
that's open source and clear, like people can choose to use it
The
or
goal
not.
is
It's
for it
not,
to work. The goal is
right,
for it
right,
to
right.
work. And if it works, it could be adopted, improved, run, engaged with. So it's sort of like it's like a fake goal, decentralization at that shouldn't be the goal. But the goal should be something like, at this stage, you guys are still in design. So you got to like maintain the culture of great design, great specification
Hmm, hmm.
design, great implementation, just like a lot of healthiness and, whatever the attributes there are. But also at this stage, which is, I guess I'm just like, I know it's a hard question, but I'm throwing it out there because I feel like this is the hurdle that, in a way, Cosmos like hit and fell on its face. And,
Hmm, hmm.
to the credit of everyone involved, we all picked ourselves up after we fell on our face and got some major track burn and like kept running. So it's all, so it's all good. That's fine. We pick ourselves up. But how are, what does it look like to like nail the first hurdle, which is like shipping this epic piece of software that works, and
Hmm.
the associated specification for multiple implementations, and right out of the gate be like, yeah, and we have a technocracy that works really well for our community. We're just fucking nailing it. You got a
Right.
bug, we squash it. You got an idea, we're there for you. You're working on the, whatever it is, like who do we look to, or do we generate that from scratch to make sure that like the culture, the institutional culture and design and approach is just like best in class? Because I think that's the more than
Hmm,
the
hmm.
technological effectiveness out of the gate necessarily, which is necessary but not sufficient. It's going to be like the killer culture. And this is something that my sense of Solana is that they're really good at something that approximates
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
where they like there are people, if you are in the community and you're developing and you're doing stuff and you have an idea or you have a problem and you call people, there's going to be someone there who's professional and delightful and like is ready to like kick ass with you to figure out what's going on.
Hmm, hmm, hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, I think this is a very important question, and we're still figuring out many of those parts. Some of we have developed specific processes that I think are kind of in line with what you're gesturing towards. One of them is that we ended up developing an internal peer review system. So Helix operates in this kind of in this boundary space between research and engineering and academia and industry, and it's always been kind of amorphous. And initially we tried to interface, we want to share ideas, right? We want to like develop our own thing, and we want to develop something interesting, and we also want to talk to the rest of the world. And in order to talk to the rest of the research world, especially academia, we initially tried to interface with academic peer review. And this we found was insufficient. It's helpful. It allows us to talk to people in academia, and they have lots of good ideas, which we try to learn from and beg, borrow, or steal as much as possible. But it is very slow. And we also found that it didn't provide the kind of synthesis that we needed. So we need synthesis of like disciplines within Anoma, right? We need a peer review process that uh, reviews for legibility and consistency of a particular perspective with respect to the whole of Anoma. Like Anoma is an operating system which needs to incorporate all of these different components which come from many research fields. An academic peer review doesn't do this. Academic peer review reviews for consistency and coherence with a subdiscipline. So, for example, when we submitted a peer-to-peer paper, we got a review back that was like, here's how to explain your peer-to-peer paper with respect to the specific language and lingo sort of set of abstractions that this peer-to-peer journal uses, which are of course incompatible with like the distributed systems journals and incompatible with the cryptography journals. And Anoma needs to make them compatible. So we needed like a forcing function for synthesis that was very different than the one that was being offered by academic peer review. And we also needed something that didn't operate on 6 to 9 month timelines. So we built an internal peer review system. You could find there are a bunch of papers now published on Zenodo under the Anoma research community. Perhaps I can provide this as a link. And we're hoping to, I mean, so far we've been kind of beta testing this within Heliax in the past 6 months or so. And in 2024, we're hoping to open it up to the broader, community, especially Cosmos and Ethereum and other interested folks. It doesn't have to be Anoma specific. We'll just kind of coordinate it as a service. And I think that kind of thing could be a step in the direction of what you're discussing.
I definitely think you're right that it's one of the primitives of like a responsible, accountable techno priesthood or whatever, is taking academic peer review and improving it because it kind of sucks right now.
Right.
Like peer review has all these great things, but some of the things that aren't great about it you listed, which is the time that it takes, that you're usually filtering for reductionism and a specific discipline instead of a cross-domain synthesis. And so it's like shifting a little bit, like what's being like how and I also think I also think we could probably all learn, and I geek out on this all the time because we also have we also have developed a peer review system, although in our case it isn't for the tech stack. So although that kind of happens ad hoc with pull requests and other things for like the engineering, but not necessarily for like the architecture and specification as much. I mean, it's a little ad hoc, but where we are really disciplined, and it sounds like there's a lot of convergent evolution, is on the scientific process of monitoring, reporting, and verifying a specific ecological claim. We have a peer review process that is similar but different to an academic peer review process, so it's very interesting there. And I agree that's one of the primitives, and I think a lot about how to do that well. I wouldn't say like we've had it implemented for a while and it's working as a social process, but then it's like, anyway, there's a whole world there, which is really interesting. I think I look forward to reading over you guys' process and seeing maybe if we can learn from it, or make suggestions, because I do think that's super key. And my mind is just wondering, like, what are the other primitives and how many are there, around just sort of like having a really efficient, effective technocracy at the heart of this, where like there are technicians and they are working in good faith and in the public in order to provide maintenance and evolution of shared infrastructure for a community. Like that, there's a set of things that I think we could look at history and abstract from and say, here's the primitives that and it's probably not that hard. This is probably like an afternoon worth of work in a way that then catalyzes maybe a month of like further deeper work. And then it's sort of like, here's a good attempt at it. Like, okay, we'll try that or something. I don't think it's like, I don't think it's the type of problem that's like, oh my God, we need to spend 10 years on this. Probably it's probably 80-20. We probably get most of the way there.
Right.
Pretty quick.
So I do have one more point, but I must use the bathroom super fast.
Okay, go. Yeah, I'll pause. All right. back engaged. So sort of the topic of the thread here is responsible, accountable, dynamic, agile, responsive, lovely, and delightful techno techno
Right,
priesthood,
right.
maintaining the core of public infrastructure for a broad open community.
Well, I mean, this is a research project, but the one other thing that we've ended up coming up with that may be interesting, with regards to your question, is we've come up with a system. So my question, I've been doing some research into, trying to understand what organizations are and how they work uh, as a part of participating in one. And I think, the basic question I've been trying to answer over the past year is what is the kind of atomic unit of organizational collaboration? And I think different organizations make this, implicitly they make different choices, whether they're aware of it or not. So in like a very hierarchical organization, I would say the atomic unit is the reporting relationship. So there's like you have a manager and you do what your manager tells you to do, and your manager like tells you what to do. And that's the kind of, everyone understands that, right? And that organization may be good or terrible, it may work in different ways, but like the fundamental unit that it understands is the reporting relationship. When you want to know what to do, you ask the person you report to, and you kind of they define your success, right? And you could have a very loose organization with no kind of bidirectional relationships of any kind, where the atomic unit is just like the project itself. Like if the organization is, maybe if it's doing something very simple, this is like if you're planting. No, I don't know. Planting seeds is not a good example. If you are making burgers, maybe the atomic unit is making the burger and it's a non-hierarchical burger collective. So everyone makes burgers and everyone can see, like, did Chris make 5 burgers or not? Like, done. We don't need a lot of organizational infrastructure for this. So now um, for example, then there's the workflow system developed by Informal out of originally the collaborative web by Galois. And there, the atomic unit is something like the customer-performer relationship. So there's in workflow, there's a concept of a performer like does something, and a customer who is kind of the person who they report to, but it's not, the relationship is more on the basis of that specific, it's called a workflow in workflow. And there are, specific processes for dealing with those kinds of relationships. So the system we've come up with takes as a basic organizational unit a promise. So it's most similar to workflow, but it's different than workflow a little bit in how we incorporate time. So in workflow, there's kind of just a customer performer relationship, and that's sort of fairly long lived. And we've tried to, one thing you might want, or you typically want out of a technocracy, is you want it to like respond quickly. You want liveness, right? You want it to do the correct thing and you want it to respond relatively quickly because some problems are urgent. And at the very least, you want it to respond predictably. Like, just viewing an organization from the outside, you like send messages to it and you expect to get messages back. And the message you send might be like, here, I found a bug, please deal with it. It might be, here's my idea, please think about it. It might be, here, I want a job, please respond to me, a lot of things, right? And at the very least, one goal of organizational design is to make those responses predictable. So when you send a bug report, or when you send a job application, or when you send a idea, you should have a sense already when you send it of like when the technocracy is going to get back to you and with what. Is it going to get back with a next step? Is it going to get back with a resolution? Is it going to get back with like a paper that incorporates your idea? You want predictable response timelines. So in order to kind of try and account for that, we have built a system that we call Promise Graph. And Promise Graph, it basically extends workflow and extends the collaborative web with 2 new aspects. One is time, and the other is dependencies. So in building a complex software project, we have a lot of dependencies, and these dependencies they're not only dependencies on X must happen before Y. They're dependencies on decisions. We must learn X before we can even decide Y, right? Maybe Y is like Y1 or Y2, and we won't have enough information to decide whether we want to do Y1 or Y2 until we learn X. So Promise Graph treats as the first class organizational unit this concept of a promise. Similar to workflow, promises have two sides. So someone is, and we use the same terms. So the customer is the person to whom the promise is made, and the performer is the person making the promise. And this could be a person or a team. Um, but promises additionally have deadlines. They have time incorporated and some estimations on how long things will take. And they have dependencies. So other promises which must be fulfilled before this promise counts as fulfilled. And what we're kind of currently developing is a bunch of so we sort of, from our perspective, the basic organizational unit is a promise. Promises have time and they have dependencies. They have a customer and a performer. And the organization, like the state of collaboration in the organization, can be almost explicitly represented as a graph of promises. And this graph of promises has a kind of temporal and dependency dimension as we've incorporated these aspects into our representation. And we're currently working on, like, we actually have, I can send the link to you. We have a public write-up of what the system is, like similar to the workflow paper. We have a write-up of what the system is, how its ontology works. And we're currently developing a bunch of software tooling that's designed to make interacting with this kind of representation very easy, and also designed to provide external observers of the organization or the technocracy reliability measures. As in, if when I send the message to the organization, the first thing I get back basically is a promise of like the organization is going to deal with this message in this way. And using these kinds of reliability measures, because the graph of promises, or at least aggregate statistical measures over the graph of promises, could be made public, then the external parties interacting with this organization would have a way to say, oh, like, when people got similar promises before, how reliable were those? And they have a way to audit basically parts of the collaborative structure and the reliability of this organization without needing to be in it, without needing to see everything, and without the organization itself being, you don't need to trust the organization because all of this promise data could be time stamped to some ledger or something like this. So you have this kind of audit trail that can be inspected. So I think that could be an interesting direction.
Love it. No, I think that is a fantastic candidate for kind of what I was provoking, is like, what does it look like to have a transparent, accountable, responsible, even dare I say delightful technocracy
Right.
working to further the maintenance and evolution of digital public goods. This is exactly the type of system, social operating system, maybe, that sounds like it's a pretty awesome candidate. So if you kind of combine that system that you're beta testing and kind of like peer review and maybe a couple of other things, it sounds like there's some really great thinking about that. So that's very exciting. I definitely would love to and I'll also try to link in show notes. I'm always a little bad at post-production in the podcast. Hopefully listeners are forgiving for just trying to capture these conversations in real time and get them up more than do too much other work, because I invariably have a million other things to do, but I'll do my best on that. And yeah, I just think it's a fantastic candidate. I'm excited to read it. I definitely have followed workflow, and sort of generally I'm an organizational design and sort of like team geek myself and have ideas about that. And lots of failures to learn from in the past. So always excited to see if there's something to learn or kind of like copy, because it's hard. This is hard stuff to have kind of like open, collaborative, dynamic, and professional and accountable without falling into some like god awful behaviorist paradigm where you're like parrot and sticking people and recapitulating ridiculous hierarchies and all this stuff that is just frankly not very effective, but is what we've all been trained to in our current culture. It's that's always the knee jerk, right? Is like, oh my god,
Right.
Shift gears back into full hierarchy.
Right. Well, and I think one thing I like about this promise graph system in particular is that it strikes this nice balance between like there is a structure,
Yeah,
like promises are made to someone. So in
yeah,
some sense, there's like ad hoc hierarchy,
yeah,
but it's not persistent. It's like task specific,
yeah.
and I mean, frankly, sometimes you need hierarchy. If you want to respond to bug
Totally.
reports quickly, you need a hierarchy, like done. There's
and
no
and
other way to
and
do this.
and high functioning automatic, and there's also different
Right.
people in different domains. I mean, sometimes I think through a framework, um it's core team, um field team, task team, where you have different levels of durability. So like a core team promises are to kind of like a durable, like a durable entity, like a
hmm
community.
hmm
Like
hmm
I'm
hmm
promising to offer, like a board, as a board member or whatever, like strategic guidance to, I have this like ongoing long-term multi-year set of
hmm
responsibilities and ways of thinking, and have to show up for that. And it's a very different thing than being on a task and there you don't do one or the other, but like a task team is like I'm responsible for getting back, like for, you know working with this specific group of people to like publish the year in review report, or
Right.
I'm
Right.
responsible for, whatever the specific thing is. And then the field team in that framework is responsible to it's sort of like in the graph, it's like who are the promises made to, right?
Right.
Which might be another way of sorting the graph, which is like there are um promises made to customers, there are promises made to team members, there are promises made to sort of more amorphous like communities or other things, I
Hmm
guess, or missions, I guess. Like I might be making a promise to like the future generations or something like that. I don't know. Like that's
hmm hmm hmm
it's a little bit more abstract, but like the promise to a so that there's gradations of how ephemeral that is, with a field team in this framework being quite, it's like a stakeholder group. Like I'm making a promise to, you know um land stewards or scientists, right?
hmm
And it's more like there's a durable objective, I guess, right? And I don't know how that relates and how you guys are thinking about that. I guess, this is sort of like I'm smashing together a couple different frameworks. That's like core team, field team, task team, but also we do a lot of stuff with OKRs, with objective and key results. Although I don't feel like very proud about how we've implemented it, but we try to think through and think
hmm
about that. Sort of like with the relationship being that it isn't the again, there's different types of promises. Like we may be making a promise about an objective that has some like two or three specific measurable key results that support that objective. Like the
hmm
objective might be, like in Anoma's case, it might be, to have the most delightful developer experience, you know in managing
hmm
uh
hmm
in managing trust between counterparties or something like that. That's our objective. By the end of 2024, we have the most delightful developer experience for people developing disclosure applications. And the key results are, X, Y, and Z. We have 100% bug squashing. We have reached some developer adoption metric, and we have, whatever it is. That's where you're getting like really, specific. And then there's a set of promises to achieve those things, right? So there's like a planning process where you're like adhering to a North Star and all these things that then compiles down to individual people saying, I'm accountable for this. It's
Right.
linked to those things. So anyway, I don't know how that kind of computes. And like, I guess where I'm going with this is sort of like the ability for an organization to have a dynamic strategy that people are magnetized to and are in service to, in addition to being accountable to sort of like
hmm
discrete, functional engagements between each other.
Right. I mean, I think quite similar to what you're describing. the way we conceptualize things, planning is centered around the decomposition of promises. So, for example, the whole Anoma research team is making a promise to finish the Anoma specs by March or something. And then before we can make that promise, before we can convince the person we're making the promise to that we'll be able to, actually keep it, we need to do a lot of decomposition of that promise into like, oh, a bunch of specific promises from certain people who are writing certain parts of the specs to other people who are synthesizing those parts and other people who are reviewing those parts, right? So our planning process is in fact the like decomposition and complexification or specification of the promise graph into a much more specific like topology of promises for a particular higher level task or goal. Um, yeah, and I think in one thing that is slightly different than with our system and workflow is that in our system, promises are basically defined by what it counts for the promise to have been satisfied by a definition of done. So we're always focused around, a specific unit of work. The customer needs to be able to judge whether it is done or not. So in a case of like an OKR, like you're talking about, that could be represented as a promise where done or not is based on these specific goals. I haven't thought so much about just like generally we want to optimize in this direction without, uh, you could make a promise that says that you'd still need someone to judge it. But yeah, I think that that's also important
Well, the other big
to think
question
about that
here
more.
to provoke is who decides, and how does it relate to, like, so there can be a measure of effectiveness through this sort of like transparent promise graph approach, but effective towards what? And how is that
Right.
decided, and who is deciding it? And making that, potentially making that explicit and either linking it to governance or not, right?
Right.
Like Ethereum famously is completely decoupled from any, explicit governance in terms of how the community decides what's important for
Hmm.
the evolution of the protocol, right? Cosmos is more famously like tried to deeply couple explicit governance with
Hmm.
what's being decided. Both of them are not very great examples of it working very well, I would say. And sometimes yes, sometimes no, I don't know. Not what I would aim for if I was
Right.
trying to create a really great, you know, best in class kind of alternative to that. And so, sort of like, how is strategy and resource allocation decided? Not just how are we judging our effectiveness once that decision has been made. And that doesn't, it's sort of like, and we have this chicken or the egg problem as well. Like in our case, in Regen's case, the chicken or egg problem has to do with, we've created a protocol that we call the registry program that is a way of creating new ecological credits,
Hmm.
how you report, how you run a peer review process, what you're accountable for, who's accountable for what in this sort of like complex scientific and legal process of creating a unit that represents
Hmm.
a promise between a land steward and someone who's buying that unit. And we
Hmm.
call that, it's called the program. But, so it's the Regen Registry program, and you
Hmm.
follow that program to sort of like generate a credit. But
Hmm.
who decides how upgrades happen to the program and under what conditions? And, that happens currently in an ad hoc way. The answer is, in all honesty, we decide when that happens.
Hmm.
We do that through stakeholder processes and internal review processes and other things, but making those implicit or tacit cycles and processes more explicit, and kind of like dog fooding our own tools so that there's like a little mini process that the people who are actually currently responsible just need to like sign on a group account or whatever, or a DAO implementation, a little thing that says we've decided to move from version 1.3 of the registry program to 1.4, and you can refer to the GitHub pull requests or whatever, and we've all reviewed it and we've pressed the button and we've done it in service to this larger aim, right? Again, which is this thing. Anyway, this like all again kind of continuing to boil down to what does it look like to have a responsive, engaged sort of technocracy in service to public a public project is, it's a hard question, but somehow feels in a way like that's maybe even more so than the actual product that we create is really important, because it's like, I don't know, it's not an either or, but the how and the what get really deeply entangled. So
Right. I mean, there are a lot of questions there, and at least, our approach with Promise Graph is, I think, more modest in that what we're trying to create is a tool for making parts of the organizational relationship and the organizational promises and the topology of who is responsible for what explicit easily, as in like they're already there, and making a tool and a standardized language that allows people to make those relationships explicit in a way that is legible to other people to whom they disclose them.
yep, that
I
makes sense.
think like the whether or not a specific topology is correct, or whether how to represent amorphous entities like community, these are hard questions that the promise graph system does not try to answer.
Are you guys
We want to
building the
go,
promise graph system into some sort of like proto DAO tooling for use on Anoma in the future? Is that kind of like, okay,
yes.
we're in the middle of this, we're trying to do this, we're trying to encode this so that then groups of people can kind of like collaborate and yeah, oh cool, that's awesome.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, another explicit design goal is to be sort of agnostic to organizational boundaries. All the judgment is like localized always to the customer of a promise. So if you make me a promise, I decide whether or not I like accept that promise. And if I accept that promise, there's this chain of responsibility. So because I'm accepting that promise as a dependency into some promise that I'm making for somebody else, I also, in order for my promise to be credible, I need your promise to be credible to me. So nothing about the system says anything about like who is paying people or who is, what the legal organizational boundaries are. But it does, and it doesn't assume, the people who are making promises need to like only accept promises from other people who they trust to be able to complete them. And hopefully this will, or at least in principle, it seems like it would be able to work across organizational boundaries. So you could even have a responsive technocracy that is not, not in any legal sense controlled by one party or one like group or DAO or whatever, but is just a graph of promises that has enough information that's the information is distributed, but enough information about reliability and locality that it can be very responsive, right? Because even in organizations that are, there are large bureaucracies which are relatively competent. They're rare and maybe they're going away, but they do exist. And large bureaucracies which are relatively competent, I think are not relatively competent because they're like controlled by one person. They're relatively competent because the individual links in the chains are reliable, because people have gotten used to like their specific relationships with other parties, and they can make and receive promises, and they've standardized some procedures in ways which work reliably. And so as the reliability of a large organization is basically the multiple of the reliability of all of its parts. So if one part is very unreliable, the whole thing will be very unreliable, right? Even if most of the parts are reliable. Only if all of the parts are reliable will you get a product that is still reliable to an external user. And so our goal is to try and model like be able to capture those kinds of statistics over time and to make them available to just the individuals within the organization who are making promises. So
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess sort of the last thought brainwave before we wrap up here is just that, the holy grail here is to have, I would say, is to have probably a couple of different formal, I don't know. I don't really know if this is a schema, an ontology, or a taxonomy, but somewhere in between. A
Mm-hmm.
couple formal expressions of the language of promises
Mm-hmm.
to choose from. Be able to choose one as an organization, and then be able to mine the transcripts of meeting conversations
Mm-hmm.
to
Mm-hmm.
to auto populate a promise graph
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
out of the places where we actually make promises,
Right.
where
Yes,
we're having a
I'm thinking.
conversation, we're hashing
Yeah,
things
yeah.
out, and we get to the place where I'm saying I promise that I'm gonna, you know, get this done by this date, and and we have consensus about what the promise criteria is, and we can
Mm-hmm.
actually, because so much of the implementation of these things falls short at the data entry point, where we
Mm-hmm.
then, okay,
Mm-hmm.
great, and then I go and I get cranking and I'm doing stuff and whatever, and I may or may not have actually gotten that promise entered correctly into the abstract system, wherever it is it on Notion or Asana or over in GitHub or whatever it is. And
Yeah.
then by the time I get there, maybe it's changed a little bit, or the other people, and because I didn't get it in, the people who have dependencies didn't get it in, and then there's a cascading. Anyway, so much of it is actually, so how do we get to that user, sort of like user experience that just really clicks in with the human
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
process
Mm-hmm.
of making agreements with one another through our verbal communication? I'm excited. I know we're going to cross that threshold. It's just like a couple years before, you know Google Calendar and Docs and all the other things kind of created this like lovely integrated cloud, multiple people collaborating experience. I was bumping up and being like, man, it'd be really great if I could just collaborate with somebody on a single document. Gosh, this is so annoying. And then it happened.
Uh-huh.
But it took a little bit of time. It was a little lag. I kind of feel like we're at a similar moment where we're about to have the like voice to text LLM, constrained constitutional, model ability to get into that kind of user experience where we can, make commitments and agreements and then encode them and track them,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
express them with one another without me having to go back into my work tracking, so that I get to get served the data and I get to see the data and
Right.
I get to engage with the data instead of having to, go take 30 minutes to do grooming or whatever. So anyway, that's
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I want there's this scene from the Foundation novels by Asimov, and I haven't seen the TV series or whatever, so I'm just talking about the thing in my mind when I read the books, where I don't know if it's Harry Seldon, but some of the psychohistorians are looking at the graph of psychohistory, and kind of twiddling threads and seeing how things change and stuff like this. And they have, I forget what it's called, I don't know. They have a device that kind of renders the thing in three-dimensional space.
mhm.
And this is how I imagine you would want to render the promise graph. Like you want almost a holographic projection because it's a graph. It's like mapping it to two dimensions is okay, but it's better to have more. And where you can see like which are the links and which are there's no one true perspective, but if you aggregate different data over time, you can analyze reliability, you can analyze like when things happened, you can trace back, you want to be able to trace back if some promise was broken without saying that like some person did a bad thing, right? The system itself in collective organizational memory needs to adjust so that it can make reliable promises in the future. And in order to do that, you need to be able to trace back the causal chain to like which, dependency of this was broken, which thing had to be replanned, like how do we adjust our model of promise making in the future, so that we can provide, better reliability. So yeah, I think there's a lot of fertile ground there also with LLMs for data entry, as you mentioned, with conversions between formats of different visual and textual representations of things. People have very heterogeneous preferences,
Yeah.
but also with kind of a stable ontology backing that all, so that there is a single source of truth,
Yeah.
and everything kind of interfaces through with that.
Yeah, totally. Um, well, love it. This has been super fun, Chris. I know I've got a couple other things to dig into today, so I think this is probably a good moment to wrap. But thanks so much for giving us the time to kind of walk through the depths of Anoma and some of the intention and the processes. I certainly learned a lot. I've got some great notes of things that are good provocations and new ways of thinking about things. So I'm excited
Uh,
about that. And yeah, happy New Year. Thanks for
Happy New
starting it.
Year.
Yeah.
Thank you
This is
so
great.
much.
Yeah. Um, until next time.